Back when I was a young, dumb high schooler, my older brother sold his drum kit and bought us one of these, the Sony PlayStation 3. Learning the instrument was a waste of time anyway, and I won't ever forget all the games we got in the first few years of owning this thing. Motorstorm, Little Big Planet, Resistance, COD 4, Virtua Tennis 3, Skate, Oblivion, Battlefield Bad Company, GTA 4, the list goes on. One of those games was the polarizing platformer Mirror's Edge. Now, I loved Mirror's Edge when it came out, and I still remember the day I bought it. Back then, I played through it 3 times, once on every difficulty, and one of those times I even finished it without shooting a single enemy. I loved the sense of speed and style, and the unique and visceral nature of the gameplay really hooked me in. With the release of Mirror's Edge Catalyst earlier this year, I thought I'd return to this fond memory of a game. The question is, how does Mirror's Edge hold up? Well, I'm glad you asked. I remember being immediately floored by the visual design when I first saw Mirror's Edge. It's a beautiful and striking aesthetic. The use of color and negative space really adds something to every area in the game, and the entire city looks like an urban utopia. This design makes the city feel lifeless and empty at times, as if it were designed by an IKEA employee, but I think that's somewhat intentional for reasons I'll discuss soon. Mirror's Edge is nothing short of a marvel to look at, and there's no doubt the visuals will stand the test of time. This is helped in part by some impressive bloom, reflections, motion blur, and depth of field view effects, as well as some NVIDIA physics elements. You'll find yourself toying with the physics stuff wherever you can, it is just so amusing. The game runs on the Unreal Engine 3, and it's no technical masterpiece, particularly not by today's standards, but the technical side is easily strong enough to accommodate and enhance the art style, which is its obvious strength. Footsteps, whizzing gunshots, wind, and breathlessness dominate Mirror's Edge's sound design. You really get that feeling of fresh air whilst gliding between rooftops. Enemy chatter and gunshots lend themselves to the intensity, and the music drums up at all the right times. Featuring both ambient and heart-pumping electronic tracks, the soundtrack fits the game wonderfully and strengthens an otherwise great atmosphere.
Okay, I got it from here.
Okay, they're playing Traversal.
I'll be fine. Get out of here!
You gotta get off that roof, Dave. Don't care how you do it, just do it.
That's not to say the sound design doesn't have its faults. When the player is wielding a gun, their own gunshot sounds are very tinny and insubstantial. Also, the voice acting is bland. The lead character Faith sounds particularly bored throughout the game, which doesn't do any favors for an already underwhelming plot.
You there, kiddo?
Hey, Mark.
I bet you're listening to the chatter.
You know me.
Try and get some sleep. It's been a rough day.
Mirror's Edge stars Faith, a parkour courier or runner who finds herself caught up in a murder mystery thriller after her sister is framed for assassinating a politician. I'm not going to go into more detail, and that may seem like I'm being just lazy, but it's really not worth talking about more in any positive light. Saying the story is a missed opportunity is an understatement, and coupled with poor pacing, boring acting, and dull writing, I think the source of the problem stems from the characters themselves. No one in Mirror's Edge is interesting. For a game with such character, its characters have barely any. They're all one-dimensional actors that don't fit into their set. Aside from a brief opening cutscene, the game isn't too interested in exposition or character building. Because you're playing as Faith, you'll naturally want to relate to her, yet the most interesting thing that can be said about Faith is that she's an Asian female lead in a big-budget video game. At times, the game appears to want you to sympathize with Faith's posse, particularly her sister who acts as a crux to the story. The problem is, you're never given any reason to care about her, and it results in not one, but 2 of the most awkward video game hugs you'll ever see. This story's biggest sin is how it squandered all opportunities to capitalize on Mirror's Edge's spectacular setting and style. Though the city may look like an urban utopia, it feels much more like a dystopia. Themes of police brutality and political corruption undermine the cleanliness of this setting, which cleverly gives it a very oppressive and controlled feel, which is why the whole IKEA thing kinda works. Yet the story doesn't take advantage of its setting in any way. It's mostly told through these 2D cutscenes between each chapter, which aren't completely awful, but they pointlessly diverge from the game's superior in-game graphic style, and the writing and acting do them no favors. Alongside these cutscenes, in-game radio dialogue and in-engine first-person cutscenes fill out the rest of the storytelling. Environmental storytelling is also experimented with, such as with bulletins in the elevators, but for the most part, it's just for world building and Easter eggs, some of which are actually pretty amusing, such as the mysterious janitor. Honestly, this method of storytelling is much more effective and memorable in this game, but they don't use it nearly as much as they should. It's another missed opportunity. Being a first-person platformer, Mirror's Edge is about getting from point A to point B as fast as possible. Mechanically speaking, you have a plethora of different maneuvers at your disposal, such as jumping, wall running, vaulting, fighting, and sliding, and using these you set out to find the fastest route you can through each environment. It's fun to learn all these mechanics, and the better you get at it, the better it feels to play. The mechanics rely entirely on player skill, and thanks to the level design and the amount of moves at your disposal, the skill cap is very high. However, it's not flawless. The roll, which is used to break large falls, irks me for a couple of reasons. One, you can't roll under things that you can slide under, and two, the more annoying reason, is that it slows down to a crawl once you come out of it. The roll is often the best way of landing without exploiting a glitch, yet it breaks momentum and ultimately messes with the flow of the game. The swinging momentum also feels a bit weird, and Faith doesn't always grab onto pipes when she should have, which resulted in some frustrating falls. But again, the platforming mechanics are fun and inventive. Then there's the combat. Good lord, the combat. The melee system is functional but not fun. The idea is you combine your hits with parkour moves such as kicking while sliding or jumping to deal maximum damage. Fighting doesn't feel good because the enemies react poorly to being hit and each hit does too little damage, which isn't helped by the restrictive camera movements. The fastest way of taking guys out is by using the counter system, which involves simply pressing a button while an enemy telegraphs a melee attack, and there's a slow-mo button on a cooldown which best helps for doing this. It both knocks the enemy out and steals their weapon. Once you have their gun, you'll probably want to get rid of it though, because the gunplay is even worse than the melee combat, which is surprising considering the developers made all these games. The guns sound terrible, the animations suck, they don't do enough damage, and they slow Faith's movement speed. If you don't have to use them, don't. Thankfully, you don't actually have to use them too often. Most combat encounters in Mirror's Edge can be avoided, which works to the game's strengths in its traversal system and minimizes its weaknesses in the combat. While avoiding combat might be the most fun option, it's often the hardest and most frustrating, so less experienced players will just suffer through the combat before continuing on, as it usually takes too much level knowledge and skill to avoid. A few of the later encounters make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to avoid the combat. One encourages you to use a gun to complete the objective, which you have to fight an enemy to acquire. There's even a boss battle at one point, which is about as bad as it could be. It's a real shame these parts are in here, as it brings down the overall experience. With the nature of platformers, Mirror's Edge's mechanics rely entirely on its level design, and for a while it's great. You're quickly gliding between rooftops and finding your own path. The strengths of the movement mechanics are married with the level composition, and finding the quickest route you can feels liberating. Looking at the moment-to-moment gameplay, finding the best path might involve something as obvious as vaulting up a wall instead of climbing it, or at times it involves something more subtle. A perfect example of this is in the first level. Take a look at this staircase. Any new player would just look at this and run up it. After all, it's a staircase and that's what staircases are for. But an experienced player might do this.
Just get the hell out of there. Wires are going crazy.
That felt really great to pull off and was both faster and more challenging than taking the stairs. It feels inventive and tests players while still catering for new players. These situations are where Mirror's Edge is at its best. Unfortunately, the quality of the level design is not always so strong. After not long, the game insists on forcing you into cramped indoor areas, and at times it feels much more like a puzzle game rather than a platformer. Of course, if you've memorized the puzzles and know the quickest route, then this isn't much of a problem, but for the rest of us, it's just frustrating and messes with the overall pacing. There is a thing called runner vision, which highlights parts of the level in red, indicating a simple path, but this path is not the optimal one, so I like turning it off because that way it's more fun to find your own way in open areas. It can help in solving puzzle-like situations though. Instead of catering to new players like the staircase example did, these parts just overly punish players, which can be said about most of the combat scenarios too. It doesn't help that the movement is inherently clumsy whilst moving slow. Mirror's Edge's levels remind me a lot of the original Sonic the Hedgehog. Sometimes the levels are open, multi-path, fast, and fun like Green Hill Zone, and other times it's cramped, slow, single path, and features an awkward use of the core mechanics like in Marvel Zone. To put it simply, the good parts are really good and the bad parts are really bad. Why the game forces you to slowly turn valves or play out an animation every time you press a button is beyond me. I found out there's a simple glitch only on PC which speedrunners use to surpass these long-winded animations, but the animations shouldn't be in the game in the first place and you shouldn't need to exploit a glitch just to skip them. You're also forced through vents all the time in Mirror's Edge, and this both figuratively and literally pulls the game down to a crawl. I understand that the vents along with the elevators are likely for loading purposes, but there are just so many of them, and it's frustrating having to stop and start so often. Even speedrun videos, which are fantastic by the way, have boring vent crawling in them. With the levels getting worse and the combat getting more frequent and difficult over time, Mirror's Edge really starts with its best foot forward. The pacing is all over the place, and with all the forced stopping and starting, the game doesn't always respect your time, which is a shame considering it's not a very long game even for new players. That's not a blanket statement of course, as speedrunners have found a way to finish Mirror's Edge in about half an hour, but for everyone else it's just frustrating. I think the designers wanted to add variety rather than just having large multipath areas, but the more open levels are strong enough to sustain an entire game, and it shows a lack of confidence in Mirror's Edge's strengths. I don't mean to put Mirror's Edge down too much however, because when the level design is good, it's fantastic, and overall the good does outshadow the bad. I had some difficulty writing this review because, as I've said, if you're skilled enough, a lot of the game's faults can be quickly overcome. You could argue that because of this, Mirror's Edge's problems don't matter, and I can imagine comments on this video simply saying I'm too bad at it to properly enjoy it, but I disagree. The game should reward skilled players, but not at the cost of new players. Like the staircase part does in the first chapter. Becoming good enough to fly through the levels, even the bad ones, shouldn't be as grueling as it is. Something I neglected to mention earlier was that I played this game on normal difficulty on this playthrough, which I suspect most people would for their first time because the game literally recommends that you do just that. I recommend everyone to only ever play this game on easy just because the combat is that bad. Something that helped me write this review was a graph by this guy, which sometimes comes up when people analyze Mirror's Edge. Don't expect me to pronounce his name, but he basically came up with a graph which describes a person's mental state whilst they're doing an activity. It compares the challenge level of the activity to the skill level of the person, and depending on these measurements it returns a mental state. For example, if someone is doing something difficult that they aren't very good at, then they're probably freaking out. Of course, I'm simplifying this a lot. There are things called perceived skills and perceived challenges which play a role, but for the sake of this example we're just going to leave it at that. Flow is when you're in the zone. This is when you're the happiest and fully immersed. Usually, this is where game designers want you to be. Because this is based on personal skill, I'll be describing this example from my perspective. I'm an average to good Mirror's Edge player, so it should be fairly relatable for most of you. Whilst trying to minimize combat and only use parkour to complete the game, I felt Mirror's Edge absolutely put me in the zone. Like I said earlier, speeding between rooftops as fast as possible feels great, but all the inconsistencies in the level design made the challenge vary way too much relative to my skill. The puzzle sections were so damn boring because they took trial and error and exploration to complete rather than skill, and many of the combat sections were way too hard for me when I was trying to actually avoid the combat. People who've mastered the game will usually be in flow because they've memorized methods to do everything, and can just focus on their own skill to complete these methods. I just don't think that it's worth all that effort just to master it. It may sound like I'm being hypercritical towards Mirror's Edge, but that's mostly because there's so much potential here. Being a game that's on average 6 hours long according to how long to beat, or 4 hours on my last playthrough, it doesn't really have any excuse to have so much downtime and missed opportunities. I want to emphasize that I still quite like this game, and I definitely recommend it if you're interested. It's by all means worth playing for the many great moments and presentation, and it's novel playing such a unique AAA game. But I'll concede that returning to Mirror's Edge came with a tinge of disappointment, and it really didn't leave the best taste in my mouth.